Goenka and Nicholas Bruch. Nakul is with the Houston Legal Tech Association, which recently founded like 6 months ago, and Nakul will later on also talk about this. And Nick recently recently joined EY as a lead knowledge analyst for legal tech and tax. And they are both going to speak about legal tech and cybersecurity at law firms, at US law firms especially. And I will give you a heads up that you can always ask questions via chat, or later on we also have a Q&A session in the last 20 minutes around. And there will be a recording of this webinar later available at YouTube. So Nakul and Nick, I would like to give you the word.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you so much. Nick, if you don't mind, I would just like to introduce Houston Legal Tech Association and a little bit about myself, and then of course would love to hear from you so that the listeners can get to know us a little better, and then we can carry on with the presentation. So first of all, thank you very much, Julia and European Legal Tech Association for organizing this. My name is Nakul Goenka. I am president and founder of Houston Legal Tech Association, which was founded in December 2018, so a little over 6 months ago. The main sort of reason for creating this organization, or Houston Legal Tech Association, is similar to what ELTA is doing in Europe. It's to actually platform where you can bring different ecosystems of people together, and these ecosystems include lawyers. They may be working at law firms as associates, partners, etc., or they may be in-house legal counsels or general counsels, and then of course the law students as well, who are studying today to become lawyers of tomorrow. So that's one ecosystem. The second ecosystem being the business people, people who run or managing the business, and third of course is the IT practitioners, or the people who are actually developing technology. And why we feel it's important to bring these people together is, as sort of we will talk about in the presentation today, just how the legal tech landscape is, and how it's rapidly changing, and what technology is doing to the legal market itself. And secondly, there exists a big communication gap. And to cite from my own personal example, I joined a software development company a few years ago as their in-house counsel, and I was invited for a lot of meetings with the IT practitioners or the techie people. And I thought they were speaking in English, but I was just having a really difficult time understanding what that information really means to me, or to the company, or me as a consumer. So I saw that there was a big gap between what IT folks are seeing versus what lawyers are understanding on the other hand, and therefore it was important to break down that barrier of communication so that lawyers can actually consume technology to help them in their business as the landscape becomes more competitive and challenging on one hand, and on the other hand, the IT folks actually understand what lawyers need, and they can sort of, the innovation can be focused on helping attorneys actually get their job done. So with that preface, I would just like to turn it over to my friend Nick, who's also with us today, to start the presentation.
Sure, I'll introduce myself very quickly. My name is Nicholas Bruch. I am the lead knowledge analyst at EY for tax and legal. Before coming to EY, I just joined EY about 3 weeks ago. Before that, I was the lead analyst for ALM for 4 years. That ALM, for those who don't know, owns the American Lawyer, Law.com, and a whole host of other legal industry-facing publications. Before that, I was a law firm consultant, first in London and then also in the UK. And so I've been sort of studying the legal market in one form or another for, a decade and a half or something like that. My job very much is a researcher. I research the legal industry. I look at the data. There's a lot more data on the legal market than I think most people appreciate. I study that data. I I turn it into research for EY, for people out in the marketplace. I write articles, I speak at conferences, and that's very much what I do. And I'm hoping to talk to you guys a little bit, not just about technology, but also some of the broader market trends that are underpinning and driving what we're seeing in the technology space. I think most people who work in the technology space know that technology is a means to an end. It's not an end to itself. And so understanding what the drivers are is really sort of the most important thing. And then the technology sort of fits into that. That said, where I want to start this is sort of looking at trends in the broader marketplace and talking about why this matters and how this is driving legal tech and what we're seeing. And so where I want to start really is sort of the legal news in a sense. I think if we talk a little bit about what we see on a day-to-day basis in the legal news, what we see regularly in the legal news is sort of stories about changes on the client side. That's a big topic over the last 4 or 5 years, where we're seeing clients talking increasingly about pushback on rates, on all sorts of things. That I'd say is some of the biggest news we see. And this very much started in the downturn. This has been a journey, I'd say, over the last decade. And it's been a journey that started with rate freezes. It went to a focus on insourcing and legal operations and vendor management and insourcing and legal tech. And it progressed as we went. And as that sort of process has moved, we've moved to an area where sort of the law department looks very different than it did 15 years ago. And the law department today is we're seeing law departments tell us consistently, if you look at the data on law departments and what they say about how they are using law firms, they say they're insourcing more. 80% of law departments tell us they're insourcing more. 68% tell us they're using alternative service providers more. Those are providers like the Big Four. EY, obviously, where I work, is a alternative service provider, but so is Elevate and Integrion and lots of others. And 40% tell us they're using law firms less. And that, I think, sets up this sort of us versus them dynamic for a lot of law firms. A lot of law firms feel like the trends are playing against them. Now, what's interesting about that is actually, if you look at the data on the law firm side, it sort of tells a very different story. Law firm revenues are growing. They've been doing reasonably well. Law firms grew by 5.1% last year. They grew faster than the accounting industry. They grew faster in the U.S. economy. They also grew faster in the global economy. 81% of firms improved profitability. 25% of firms increased profitability by 10% or more. The U.S. law firm industry and also the European one is really on pace to have their best year in well over a decade. That sets up this sort of weird dynamic where, on the one hand, we're talking all the time about corporate counsel doing things that seem against law firms. And on the other side, we're seeing law firms post the highest profitability they've posted, higher profit per lawyer, higher revenue per lawyer. These two things seem at odds. And I think a lot of people in the legal market struggle on how do we square this story, right? Can we talk about legal operations and budgets getting tighter and technology increasing, and at the same time law firms doing quite well? And that's really where I want to start on this technology conversation, is sort of how do we square that story? Because I think if we can square it and understand where the industry is going, we can start to figure out how technology fits into this story. And I think not a bad place to start is sort of with the client, right? And one story I hear a lot is this idea that the law department is going to take on the role of the general contract. This is a story that I hear a lot in the legal market. It's a story I hear from general counsel. It's a story I hear from law firm consultants and law firms. The question is sort of, what does that mean, right? And I think that's a really legitimate question. I think a lot of law firms today are sort of scratching their head and saying, what does this future look like, right? What is the core competencies of an in-house team that is a general contractor? What does this mean for service providers? What does it mean for how much work will be done in-house? this concept doesn't quite answer a lot of those questions. And I think what's interesting is if you start to look at some of the data on law departments, you start to see some of the trends emerge, and you start to get answers to these questions about the future role of the law department. One thing you see right away is that insourcing really has been a dominant trend in the post-downturn era. I think if you look at these lines, what you're seeing on these lines, the blue line and the red line on this graph, are headcount. Headcount at lawyers. This is U.S. law firms, but this is the same if you look at European law firms. Also, you're looking at in-house teams. What you see is sort of in the post-downturn period, from the period of sort of 2000 to 2010, those lines are basically moving together, right? They go up in the pre-downturn period, they go down in the post-downturn period, and then something fundamentally changes around 2011. The red line obviously accelerates. That's in-house teams get bigger. Law firms basically flatline. Their growth basically has been stable for the last 5 or 6 years. And that's really the big question, is sort of what role is this insourcing going to have? And it has spillover effects, obviously, on technology. If law departments are going to be doing a lot more work, they may become purchasers of technology. They may also, law firms may have to change what they do. They may need to increase or decrease the use of certain kinds of technology. And so it immediately starts to have impacts. The question is sort of why? Why do law firms insource? Well, the answer on some level is sort of straightforward. If you look at the cost of hiring a law firm lawyer, what you see is that it has increased dramatically over the past, let's call it 2 decades, 3 decades. What we see is that the cost of hiring a lawyer has gone up 131% since 1996. That's twice the rate of inflation. Today, the cost of hiring a lawyer in the United States is $840,000 a year if you were to hire a law firm lawyer all year long. Versus an in-house team, if you include all the benefits and all of that, the average cost is $280,000. Now, these are sort of, it's difficult to compare these two because often law firm lawyers do slightly different things than in-house lawyers. But the cost difference is dramatic, and it's frankly the reason why so much insourcing has happened. What's interesting about this insourcing, and keep in mind, law departments have added 30,000 additional headcount in the past 10 years, right? Law firms have on the other side added about 2,000 new headcount. What's interesting about all that insourcing is it makes the law department the odd man out in most corporate services. If you look at most corporate services, what you see is there's the dominant trend in corporations, and any business school student will tell you this, is that it's outsourcing, right? It's not insourcing. Everybody knows this story. And it started in IT, right? IT services were the first to be outsourced, but it's migrated to finance, to marketing, to HR. Everything these days is every corporate function has an outsourcing component to it. And that has left the law department as the odd man out. And it has left a lot of law departments scratching their heads, adding a headcount, while all the other departments are either decreasing headcount or at least keeping the same. And it's created a lot of uncomfortableness with GCs and also their CFO counterparts. There's good reasons why most companies outsource, right? The most obvious is cost cutting. If you ask Fortune 500 companies or Global 2000 companies why they outsource, what you see is that the most say it's a good cost-cutting tool, but there's also lots of other good reasons that would be really useful for the general counsel, right? It enables a focus on core services. It enables you to solve capacity issues, right? When demand spikes or conversely it troughs. It allows expertise to access to expertise. There's all sorts of benefits. The question, of course, is why didn't law departments insource? And I would suggest that insourcing is an outcome of another trend, and it's an important trend to keep in mind because it's a trend that is changing rapidly. If you look at the vendor environment in the legal world, right, it is dominated by law firms. What we're looking at here is all of the vendors. We don't often think of law firms as vendors, but they are. If we look at all the vendors in the legal industry with over $100 million in revenue, and why choose $100 million? It's sort of an arbitrary line, but essentially what we're saying is the vendors that are capable of providing services at scale. what we see is that law firms basically dominate it, right? Out of it's 98% of the providers are law firms. This has set up an environment where law departments essentially had two options. One, they could use law firms and the higher costs that they bring, right? We saw that on the earlier slide, or they could in-source, right? Or they could use sort of a small collection of alternative service providers. That's the environment. What we're seeing is this setup is dramatically changing. If we look at the legal news over the last year, and what I've done is I've grabbed a few articles from the American Lawyer, from law.com, from other news sources. And I think if you look at this, you can see the vendor landscape is changing. And we can see that it's changing not just on legal services, but also legal tech. And that is fundamentally sort of the biggest trend today in the legal world. And we see certain kinds of changes, right? We see the mergers. Everyone knows that there's lots of law firm mergers. There's lots of transatlantic mergers. We also see, of course, some legal tech investments that I think Nakul is going to talk about. We also see some alternative service providers either doing acquisitions or sucking in capital or doing partnerships. And of course, also we see the big four. And, you know, I work for EY. EY has acquired Riverview. Even not on this slide, actually, is EY's acquisition of Thomson Reuters. But on top of that, we've got Deloitte doing alliances with law firms. We've got PwC doing alliances with law firms. And this is sort of fundamentally the biggest change in the legal provider landscape. And as we sort of go through, I want to talk about how this is impacting the legal tech space and how it's impacting the way law firms compete and win work. And then that obviously will have impacts on how they use technology. But I'm going to throw it over to you, Nakul.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So I think just adding to what Nick was talking about in terms of the trends that we are seeing. So if you think of it broadly, there are a couple of trends that are emerging, right? One is, of course, there are these big four like EY, Deloitte, etc., who have who already have a big presence all around the world, and they've sort of entered the legal market and they've started to provide legal services. So that's one broad theme where you have the big four and firms like big four who sort of entered the legal market. Second is, of course, the alternate legal service providers, who also Nick talked about in terms of how they have been taking away a part of the law firm's market share. Slowly but steadily over the last couple of years since the time they've come out into the market. And third, of course, is the way legal services themselves are being delivered, meaning that a lot of the legal services are being commoditized. So you have different companies like a Rocket Lawyer or a Zoom Lawyer, where you can actually go and instead of sitting down with an attorney to explain what you want in a contract, there are ready-made templates available to suit your needs, and people are just consuming services in a completely different way. So having said that, this slide sort of, we just wanted to talk about if you think of all these different factors and how they're impacting the legal market, and what does the framework really look like for technology within the legal industry. So we've broken it down into sort of three different kinds of technologies or solutions. First, of course, is the enabler technologies, which sets the basis or for the law firms to actually compete. So, for example, cybersecurity, which we'll talk about later, or migration to cloud, which is again being used to provide mobility and access to people on the go, which is turning out to be a competitive advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it. Second category is, of course, the support process technologies, which is more for the back office or the administrative work. Some of the, like Nick mentioned, a lot of these services are being outsourced. They are either being outsourced to service providers, or they are outsourced to software, such as this case management software or your HRM, human resource management softwares for accounting, billing, timekeeping and tracking. All these are sort of relevant technologies which help operations go efficiently in the law firm. And third is, of course, the substantive law solutions, which are actually doing sort of the work of what a lawyer or a paralegal has been doing at law firms. We were recently, earlier this year, we were at a conference in New York. It's called Legal Week. And one of the themes around, one of the keynote speakers in that particular conference was Brian Kuhn, who was the founder of IBM Watson Global, and he made a bold statement. And the statement was that law firms that don't adopt technology will simply cease to exist. And I think this slide just shows in terms of the activity that has been going on. Over almost $1 billion have been invested in legal tech in 2018, with lower number of deals as compared to 2017. So what that tells us is that, of course, the deal sizes are getting bigger and bigger. And about 35%, which is majority, are actually being invested in solutions utilizing artificial intelligence. Now, AI, it's still in the nascent stage as in the context of law firms. Obviously you have some solutions where or use cases rather where you have information fed into the AI system, and then you ask a question. For example, you talk about real estate law. There's a tool out there and built by IBM where you just ask a question, and the AI tool is able to scan through and resource millions of pages of research, case law, statutes, and give you an accurate response in terms of what it really means. So this has the ability to drastically cut down the amount of hours that one associate or a paralegal would be spending doing some research work, as opposed to just asking a question to a computer. Right, and then bringing it into the context of USA, why USA is seeing sort of a higher adoption rate. A couple of reasons. Of course, I think the way laws are structured here, or what the civil procedure or the criminal procedure laws have been laid down in terms of how discovery is to be conducted. It's quite document intensive, so that's why you see a lot of investments now where monies are being invested to develop technology which can scan through millions of pages of documents. And I think on that note also, that is going to be a major competitive advantage to a law firm over the other in the coming years. What I mean by that is the ability to consume structured or unstructured data and make sense out of it. That will relate directly to how much lawyers are able to bill, and if it will impact the revenue model. So, of course, the guidelines for document disclosure is one major driver. Second, of course, is, like we talked about, the legal tech market itself. Third is, of course, the access to venture capitalists and the amount of money that is being poured into. And fourth is, of course, the prevalence of just English as a global business language. So you're able to find resonance across. And finally, the consumers. If you just look at think about the consumers, a lot of the millennials make up a large percentage and will make up a large percentage of the total world population in the next 5 to 10 years. And the way millennials are sort of consuming legal services, or how they're oriented towards consuming legal services, is going to have a big impact. And law firms need to be ready to address that when thinking about law firm of the future. I think Nick, next section sort of covers the evolution of the legal market, and I'll let Nick cover that. Nick?
Yes, I'm sorry, I was on mute. So now that we've talked about trends in the legal market, we've talked about trends in the investment technology space. The thing that I want to talk about next is sort of how this all impacts the future of the legal market, and specifically how it impacts different parts of the legal market. I think if you talk to many people like me who watch the legal market, I think there's a broad belief that the legal market is going to split up into sort of two distinct markets. And we've been seeing a lot of this happening over the last, I'd say, decade, but we're seeing it accelerate to some degree. And those two markets, broadly speaking, I think are going to be sort of a bet the company segment and a run the company segment. Now, I think many people believe that there's sort of these segments already exist, but what I'd say to that is there's a lot of law firms right now who basically compete in both segments at the same time, right? They offer some vet the company services, they offer some run the company service. What I would suggest is I think that is going to become increasingly untenable. I think these are going to become very different kinds of markets with very different kinds of drivers, different kinds of technology needs, different kinds of operational needs. And we're seeing some of that play out already. The sort of immediate question that comes to mind when you start to think about the market this way is sort of how big is each of these markets? That's a really hard question to answer, in all honesty, because you're starting to sort of not only forecast, but also start to forecast split up the future, which you don't know. But broadly speaking, what we know today, if we look at the legal market today, about 40% of the market is sort of high-end services where the hourly rates are sort of 2 times or more the cost of hiring an in-house lawyer. Those are services that are frankly unlikely to be insourced. They're unlikely to be turned into delivered through technology. These are services that are sort of high value services. At the other end of the spectrum is sort of we have 40% of work that is sort of currently at risk of insourcing, where law departments are actively thinking about, should I be doing this myself or should I be sending it outside because it's cheaper for me to do it outside? Those kinds of services are services typically where we find technology can be applied and often reduce the cost of, right? And then there's sort of 20% of services that kind of live in the middle, that the hourly rates are sort of somewhere between 1 and 2 times the cost of insourcing. Those are services which often can be augmented with technology, but still often require some people involved. So what are the trends we see in each space? Well, if we look at this vet the company space, one of the most obvious trends, if we look at equity partner compensation, which is broadly speaking just the amount the highest paid talent in a law firm gets paid in compensation, what we've seen is that these sort of quote unquote, elite law firms, those top 25 law firms, their profit per equity partner has really been pulling away from the rest. If we go back to 2000, the average equity partner at one of these firms made about $1 million more than the average equity partner at sort of the bottom 100 firms, right? So $1 million difference. Funny, I talked to a recruiter once, and he said, in the legal industry, nobody makes a decision to move to another firm based on $1 million. Now, I sort of shook my head at that, but I think what the recruiter was sort of saying is, look, at $1 million, there's a lot of other things that come into play, right? There's the brand of the firm, there's the work-life balance, there's the fact that the individual may have been there for 15 or 20 years. Now we zoom ahead, right, just 18 years, and now the difference between these two data points, the average compensation for an equity partner, the top 25 or the bottom 100, now it's $3 million, right? That same recruiter, when I showed him this graph, said, yeah, people will make a decision on $3 million, right? And the point is that these firms are zooming ahead in what they can pay their top talent. And effectively, they are using that spread, right? The fact that they can pay people a lot more as a weapon. They use that weapon to attract and retain the best talent, right? And it has spillover effects on the way these businesses are run, the technologies they use, everything. The next thing we see right now is there's about 50 companies in this space. Now, you could define it sort of all kinds of ways, but I think 50 is probably a reasonable number. The question is sort of how many of these firms are going to exist sort of down the road. We don't know. What we do know is that since the downturn, about a third of these firms have been sort of struggling. They've really, their revenue per lawyer is down. They're showing other signs of weakness. And so we know this market is going to contract. We don't quite know how many of these firms are probably going to fall out, but it wouldn't surprise me if we end up with somewhere around 20 to 30 sort of elite global firms. That sort of all brings the question of sort of who are going to be the survivors, who are going to be the losers, for lack of a better term, and what are the core competencies that are going to define success. And if we can think about that, we can also start to think about the technology piece. Number one is talent management, right? We know that these firms are going to live and die by their ability to recruit and retain the best talent. The best talent will want to work on the most complicated cases. They will only, importantly, want to work on the high-value parts of that. And so the technology that these firms will need to enable these individuals to streamline their research processes and really focus on the work they actually want to do, right? The second thing that is going to be important for these firms is strategic discipline, right? These guys are going to have to know when to exit services that are becoming commoditized. There's going to be legal work that they are doing today that in 10 years from now will be commoditized either because of operational advances, technological advances, or because law departments will say, you know what, I just don't care as much as I used to about that work. As that happens, these guys are going to have to exit those services. Now, in some cases, as they exit those services, they're still going to want to remain connected to them. And so they're going to have to form partnerships. In some cases, those will be technology partnerships. In some cases, they will be partnerships with other law firms or legal service providers, with the Big Four, with other alternative service providers. They'll also, conversely, on the strategic discipline side, need to be able to spot where to invest, right? What's the next service they need to get into? Now, all of this sort of seems easy, right? Exit bad services, enter good services. This is incredibly hard, right? Exiting a service is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It often means saying goodbye to people who have become your partners, who have become your friends, and saying, look, your business no longer makes sense under our brand. Entering is also hard because it takes dollars. Investing in new areas means people have to take money out of their pockets and go invest in something else. And so this is tough stuff. The other side of the legal market is the run the company space. And this is going to be a space where technology probably plays a slightly less of a sort of supportive role and more of a driving role, right? In this market, we see people like mid-market law firms. We see ASPs. We see global law firms. We see the Big Four entering this space. The dominant trend in this space has been size, right? We've seen the biggest law firm in the world in 1995 go from 1,800 lawyers. A decade later, we were at 3,000 lawyers. A decade later, we were at 4,500 lawyers. The biggest law firm today is nearly 9,000 lawyers big, right? Law firms are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it's because in the run the company space, operating at scale really matters, right? We're also seeing law firms get much more global. And again, it's the same concept. Scale matters. Also, geographic spread matters. In order to service sort of the run the company needs of big global corporate clients, you have to have offices where they have offices in many cases. And so you see the biggest law firm today has 170 offices in 73 countries. This is sort of the big trend in this space. The sort of third big trend we see is the ASPs, a raft of new service providers entering the legal space that don't look familiar to the people who were here a decade ago. These include EY, they include Elevate, they include Axiom, they include Consiglio, IBM, Watson is there, Lawyers on Demand is there. Lots of people with very different business models are entering. Some of these players will end up dominating certain parts of the legal market. Frankly, others will probably go away either because they will fail or they will be acquired by the winners, right? In this space, when we think about who's going to win and who's going to lose, scale is going to be incredibly an important factor, and it will be, people will use scale as a weapon in sort of two important ways to think about. One is collecting and using data to improve service quality and reduce costs. This isn't just about sort of analyzing big data or using AI. Part of it is frankly pretty simple. It's looking at your data to understand where are the opportunities where I can streamline services. Where can I look at the data to understand how I can streamline processes? This doesn't have to be sort of major technological stuff, but in some cases it will be. We know that a lot of big service providers are using AI to sort of seriously look at the way they deliver services. The other thing that is going to be big in terms of weapon is investing. A lot of mid-sized law firms are struggling to invest in the new technologies. We know the big providers will not struggle at that same game. The last thing I'll say here is a client-centric model. I think what we're seeing increasingly in sort of the run the company space is the providers are increasingly starting to look and, more importantly, feel like consultants. They are becoming more consultative in their work processes. They're willing to work with clients in ways that they weren't willing to in years gone by. I think, almost all law firms talk a good game about being client-centric. That is something everyone knows they're supposed to say. It's a very different thing to actually live it. And I think some law firms are figuring it out. They're figuring out how to, not just offer their advice, but also offer sort of a more consultative experience. And I do think that's going to be a pretty big part of this going forward. The last thing I'll say, and I think this is a major piece, is that as these markets separate, as we start to see distinct parts of the legal market kind of spread out, and the sort of a run the company and bet the company space, I think what we're going to see is a lot of opportunity to partner across lines. Right? And we're seeing some of that. The big four have done collaborations with law firms. I think Margin Matrix, which is a collaboration between Allen & Overy and Deloitte, is a fantastic example. We've also seen some labor and employment alliances between law firms and the big four. We've also seen ASPs partnering with law firms. And we've also seen a whole raft of technology partnerships spring up either between the big four, between ASPs and legal tech, or legal tech and law firms. I think this is going to be a really big space where we see a lot of technology being delivered through a collaborative approach. And this is the way consulting works. This is the way accounting works. This is the way finance works. All of the major professional services are typically, there's sort of big collaboration spaces. And in legal, there just hasn't been up until very recently.
Okay. Folks, now we move on to cybersecurity at law firms and what it means. In this section, we will just touch upon the current state of cybersecurity in the context of law firms. I'll make a few bold observations or statements why we believe the security industry has sort of failed, not only the legal industry, but the industry in general. And then finally offer a solution by referencing a zero trust framework approach that was originally conceived by one of the leading security analysts a few years ago. So if you visualize a law firm, what used to be a law firm was a big building like this, and you had attorneys going in and doing their day-to-day jobs, which was of advising clients. So now think of it in the context of cybersecurity. What it means is inside this particular building, you have your trusted world, because you only allowed your associates or your partners to come in and do their work. And these sort of people who are inside your trusted world had to talk to people outside, in the outside world, which would include your clients, your vendors, your suppliers, and anybody else outside this particular law firm. So what the technologists, or how the sort of the cybersecurity market got created, was that to enable communication between this trusted world inside the building to the outside untrusted world, you basically created a firewall, a perimeter firewall. Think of a moat around this particular castle, right? And the perimeter firewall allowed interactions of these trusted world and the untrusted world to take place. And using the concept, people built large companies. So you must have heard of Palo Alto Networks. It's got market cap of $20 billion. Checkpoint Firewall, another company with a $20 billion market cap. Fortinet, Cisco, F5, you name it. And it suddenly quickly became a large sort of market with many number of countries. So a huge industry has sort of grown. But what is happening now is that today's enterprise, or today's digital enterprise, is just changing the paradigm. We've entered a new era of the modern workplace where information and technology are rapidly evolving. Business assurances and availability in the modern enterprise includes more people, more devices, more applications, more networks, more infrastructure, and more, surface area for the bad actors to attack. These are just the trends that you're seeing. Like, you have more workloads, you have people going out, we have a more larger remote workforce, you have IoT devices, you have a multi-cloud, which basically there is a big shift in terms of how law firms and other industries are actually using or moving to the cloud. In fact, there's one report by Forbes which sort of states that 83% of the entire workloads will be in the cloud by 2020. So that's a big shift. And why it impacts security is because, think of it, you had the modern the modern building where your workers were inside and they were protected by a moat, but now things are going on to the cloud. How do you draw a firewall around in the cloud where you don't know exactly where that information is sitting? Coupled with that is just the increase in the mobile workforce growth. This chart sort of represents the increase in the number of mobile users over the last 20 years, and you see that that the trend is increasing. In fact, by 2023, it is estimated that the mobile workforce is set to increase to 1.8 billion, which will probably account for 43% of the global workforce. So it's a big increase in mobility and mobile users. Coupled with the fact, if you think of your office environment today, you look around, you have a smart TV, you have routers, you have smart lighting, you have printers. All of these are connected to your network. All of these are interacting with your Wi-Fi network, with your office sort of firewall that has been set up, which makes it even more complicated. I'm sorry, I think I just so you're just seeing an explosive growth in the number of IoT devices. In fact, if you see by 2020, Gartner predicts that there'll be 20 plus billion devices, IoT devices, which includes laptops, tablets, smartphones, smart TVs, Bluetooth points, access points, security cameras, etc. And what all this really means is that your enterprise attack surface keeps growing. You give by moving to the cloud, by using mobile workforce, by the increase in the IoT devices, you are spreading your attack surface to an extent where it gives an opportunity for bad actors to get in different ways and actually compromise your networks. So this obviously brings a new set of challenges, which is where I feel like the current industry cybersecurity industry has failed to address. Coupled with the fact that there's a big shortage of skilled cybersecurity workforce itself. In fact, there are reports which suggest that there'll be 1.8 million jobs unfilled cybersecurity jobs by 2020. So what this really means in this context is, you see cybersecurity is a crowded space. There are a lot of companies who offer solutions. These are the sort of different kind of solutions that are being offered. And as more and more of humanity, industry, society, personal information, all of these things are coming online, in industry, the cybersecurity industry has not met the expectation of our customers. And I say that because the market has come to be $120 billion overall, and with more than 1,000 security vendors. And you would feel that if on one hand, the amount of money that is being spent on security is going up, and if innovation were to happen, then on the other hand, the number of breaches should be going down. But we know that is not happening. We sort of hear stories every day in the market about companies getting breached. And in fact, as the FBI director once said, a former FBI director, there are only two types of companies, right? Ones that are breached and the others that are not yet breached. So fundamentally, with this problem, I believe that there is a need to make radical changes as opposed to incremental gains that we've been making for a long time. And here I would also like to offer three observations. Just going back to the previous slide, if you see these different kind of solutions, right? What these solutions mean is that there was a specific gap or a breach that occurred, or a gap that was identified, and a point solution was developed and deployed to make sure that that particular sort of breach does not happen. Uh, One of my views is that the biggest threat to security is this hyper focus to security threats itself. What that means is that we have gotten so focused on security threats that this has become sort of our weakness. Uh, because what we are doing is that we are reacting to threats as opposed to thinking proactively. So anytime a threat or a breach occurs, we come up with a solution and we say, okay, this is a way to plug that gap, and we deploy a point solution. But what that does is that you sort of have now 15 to 20 different products running in the same organization, which becomes a massive problem to actually understand whether things are working or not. And even despite deploying these different sort of tools in your workplace, you're still not able to answer the question confidently that, hey, are we secured? And if so, how? Can you show it to me? And I think that is where a lot of security practitioners are falling short, or they're still concerned. And that is why you see why cybersecurity is so important. The second observation I would just like to make before offering a solution is as more and more applications are being created, application awareness lacks the awareness of application itself. What I mean by that is that there are hundreds of new products that are announced every day. And as we sort of, to give you an example, think of have you ever seen or heard of a modern hard hat? Uh, Initially, a hard hat used to just be a sort of hard hat which people used to wear. In America, it's usually yellow in color. But now the modern hard hat can give you a lot more information. It gives you real-time information about the machinery around you, the supply chain or the factories, etc. So just think about it for a second. For that modern hard hat to actually function, what all information does it need to process, and what other devices it needs to connect with to actually be able to supply the information in front of your eyes? That in itself is a complex web of services that are talking to each other. It's a rich network of different services, and it's a very complex application network. And unless you understand the application itself, it's not possible for you to protect it. And the third sort of observation on the cybersecurity front is that the security product, or the security product will not be, you need to have it built in. What that means is, or here's an analogy, like you in the biological machine, right? You don't carry around your respirators or dialysis machine, or don't put yourself in a bubble to prevent viruses. You don't build that. You already have an inbuilt system in your body, immune system, which protects you from all these threats as you go out into the world doing about what you need to do. Similarly, security needs to be built in. So the question is, how do you do that, and what does that really mean? So one solution, which is piggybacking on what sort of leading market analysts are saying here, is that you need to stop trusting and stop reacting, and start reducing. Be more proactive by using a zero trust approach to security. What zero trust means is, zero trust was conceived by Forrester, which is a leading market organization. It's a framework that has been sort of offered to the industry in general, and it has been gaining a lot of momentum in the last 4 to 5 years. And if implemented properly, zero trust has the power to really transform the industry. As the name applies, zero trust means you don't trust anything, and you sort of automatically assume that you are in a hostile environment, you are going to get breached, which is a paradigm shift from the traditional security measure of trust but always verify. So if you think about it, and what the market analysts are saying here in terms of cybersecurity, these are just some of the different solutions that you need to have. As you go from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, you will see the more critical things that you need to have versus the less critical things which sit on top. Unfortunately, a lot of the investments, a lot of the solutions today target, or sort of are talking about a mix of this, but not in a really wholesome manner. And similarly, there's the Forrester, the guys who came up with this concept. It has to be an intersection of people, workload, network, and devices. For law firms, data is the most critical, and that is what you need to protect. So what we sort of believe for cybersecurity in the context of law firms, at least for going by what the market analysts are saying, is that zero trust is really the way to go. It's an initial step, and you should at least budget 2 zero trust networking projects in 2019 to significantly improve security posture. And also, so this is important to understand and sort of talk to folks when talking about or thinking about cybersecurity, because often security is left as an afterthought in the race to make your environment or operations more agile, give quick access to your lawyers. Obviously, security becomes sort of an afterthought, and in the context of the legal industry, we all know, lawyers deal with large volume of information, and also majority of that information is quite sensitive and confidential. So it's important to sort of think of or keep this new upcoming trend in mind as we think of cybersecurity in the context of law firms.
Thank you, Nakul, and thank you, Nick, for sharing your thoughts and insights. So let's see, the audience, do you have any questions? You can either ask them via chat or ask your questions as well if you activate your microphone. So let's see. Maybe Nick or Nakul, maybe you also have some closing words for the participants while they're typing.
I'll say on the cybersecurity front, I particularly at ALM, I spent a lot of time talking to law firm leaders in the United States, but also globally. And I'll say that cyber was a common issue. I think it was particularly mid-sized firms were really struggling with the costs associated with meeting certain criteria or getting licensed or whatever it was, upgrading their systems. I would say almost every conversation I had with law firms, at some point cyber came up, and I do think it's something that law firms are really going to struggle with. And then I'm not a cyber expert, but I will say it's certainly top of mind.
Thank you, Nick. So I've just checked the chat. There are no questions at the moment, so I think you covered everything. No questions. Okay. So let's see. Lucas is writing anything. Thanks for the input. Super interesting. Apart from Twitter, Reddit, media outlets, what's your recommendation for keeping up?
I can answer that first. I personally, my job is an analyst, so my job is quite literally just to keep up with the industry. I use a combination of sources. One, I look at raw data on the legal industry. Not everyone has the time or interest to do that. But I do think doing some of your own primary research where you sort of go and try to look at what you personally see and form your own opinions. I think second, obviously the legal news. I try to consume a variety of legal news, not just news on law firms, which you get through people like The Lawyer, The American Lawyer, Law.com. But also in-house counsel news. You'll get In-House Counsel magazine in the United States, legal tech news. There's quite a few good outlets. So I would say I'd encourage you to sort of really kind of vary your diet. And last, I think people undervalue phone calls. As an analyst, there's sort of, there's a lot of temptation to rely on data and reports and that sort of thing. But I'll tell you, the best information I get is from a half a dozen or a dozen people. And I'd encourage everyone find, if you read the news and you find an individual quoted often, or a certain journalist, or you've been to a conference and there's a speaker who you just thought was great, reach out to that person. There's a lot of people that have reached out to me as someone, I speak a lot at conferences in the US. I get a lot out of the conversations I have with people in technology roles, in law firms, and in HR roles and all sorts of things. Those conversations, you can really get yourself informed very quickly. And so I would encourage you all to sort of, go the old-fashioned route and actually talk to people.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more with you, Nick. I think, the best way, of course, in addition to whatever media outlets are available, the best information, even in my view, comes from just talking and meeting with people. And different ecosystems, right? I mean, you could be speaking to lawyers to understand if they are using any technology, how are they using, how is it impacting them, and on the other side, talking to people who are actually innovating and creating technology to see what they think about where the market is. Talking to different people is definitely a very good source of keeping up with what's going on and what's to come.
And on that same point, on the variety, if you are going to keep sort of a half a dozen people who you try to check in with, maybe 2-3 times a year, I would include a skeptic. I've definitely met a few skeptics in the legal tech world, and more broadly in the legal world, who are skeptics that, for example, that legal tech is going to take over the legal industry, or they're skeptics that alternative service providers will end up being a major part of the legal industry. Those skeptics provide a very different point of view, sometimes wrong, sometimes right, but it's useful to have someone challenge the dominant orthodoxy for you and say, yeah, I don't believe any of it. I don't think it's going to happen. Here's my logic. I would certainly try to seek those people out, because they're usually interesting people.
Thank you very much, both of you, for answering Luca's question. There haven't been any further questions, so I think we should let everybody leave into their afternoons. And to you guys, really a big thank you for joining us today and giving us insights from your point of view.